Well, it's 7 o'clock. Wednesday evening. Glad you're here for our midweek Bible study. We're going to continue tonight, look at some questions that have been asked about certain scriptures and look at those and investigate them a little bit, see what we can come up with. If you're using your Bible, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 6. That's where we're going to be. Genesis chapter 6. We'll begin with a word of prayer. And Kurt, would you lead some prayer? Genesis 6, beginning in verse 1. 1 through 4. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those who were the mighty men were of old, men of renown. The question that comes about in this particular 4 verses here is in verse 2, the sons of God. Who are the sons of God? Who are these individuals that, what supposedly, if you just take it for value for what it says, that took them upon these daughters, married, and these giants were born to them? Who are these individuals? Does the Bible speak of them anywhere else? Well, the time frame that we have here is from creation to the flood. That's where we're in that time frame right there. The flood hasn't happened yet, and we're beyond creation several years, enough to where the population of the earth has begun to multiply. So that's where we're at. And apparently from this group of individuals is when the world got so wicked that brought about the flood that destroyed all of mankind, all but 8 souls. Now, one thing that we do know, that during this time, there's only 2 lines of descendants, 2 lines of people. You have Cain's descendants, and they're spoken of in Genesis 4, 16 through 24. And you have Seth's descendants in Genesis 4, 25 through chapter 5, 32. We don't have any descendants of Abel mentioned. And that's mainly because I don't think Abel ever got married, ever had any children. If so, they would have been mentioned. But Cain killed him before any children came about in his life. So here we have 2 descendants. And we know what the Bible says about Cain's descendants. Cain's descendants are never spoken highly of. In 1 John 3 and verse 12, it says, Not as Cain, who was of the wicked one, and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brothers righteous. And then Jude verse 11, Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, have run greedily in the era of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah. So Cain is known for his wickedness. His descendants are known for their wickedness. So you have a line of people here that's populating the face of the earth who are wicked. And you have a line of people here, descendants, who are good individuals. And I think that's where these Genesis 6 is going to, where he's showing that, and he's not going in the path that some want to take it, to think that angels, fell from heaven and came to earth and started multiplying with women, and all these giants came about, and well, that's where many want to go with it. But when it comes to the background of Seth, we know he was a godly man. And if you go to Luke 3:23 through 38, look at the genealogy there, you'll find that Christ came through Seth's genealogy, through his lineage. Christ did not come through Cain's lineage. So Cain is the wicked side of the world, and you got Seth, who is the good side of the world, the righteous side. And you know that eventually these two are going to come together. And they're going to start crossing with one another. They'll begin marrying with one another. And therefore, children become about because of this. And I think that's where this verse is going to. And what it's speaking of here is those bloodlines crossing. If we go back to Genesis 6, 1 and 2, I think that's what it's showing here. Like in verse 2, and the sons of God, that would be Seth's line, saw the daughters of men, that is Cain's line. And these daughters that came about from Cain, it says they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. So Seth's lineage saw these ladies, married into that line, and begin to intermix here. And that's where we come about bringing a group of individuals that brought about ungodliness to the point that God, is angry at the world and says we're going to destroy it and we're going to start over. And that's when we come to verse 5, Genesis 6 and verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of his thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So after this happens, this Seth line, Cain's line begin to mix, children, and then children, whatever. Well, then that's when the world gets pretty bad. And that's when God destroys it. And I'm going to say that's the explanation. We're going to look at some other thoughts on it, as some may think in a minute, but I think that's the explanation of where you go with that. Any thought on that, on those two lines, Seth and Cain, crossing? Well, we go to Job 1 and verse 6. And some will say, well, doesn't the sons of God represent angels? And it's always good when it comes to study, when you're studying something, and the first time you read it, well, what does it say? And you try to get out of it what it says. And that's always good to do that in study. But once you do that, another good study tip is that when you read it for the first time, you might want to ask yourself, well, does this contradict anything else in the Bible? Because if it contradicts, then that means that this is not going to be right. The Bible's not going to contradict itself. And what we see in Job 1 and verse 6, there's where angels are called the sons of God. And no doubt we know what this is, no doubt about it. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. 2 times, God was speaking to the angels twice, and 2 times it's mentioned in Job 1 and Job 2, the sons of God, meaning the angels. So if one were to read this, then they read Genesis 6, they might come right out and say, that's got to be angels. Because I can find it elsewhere, and that's a good study. What does this mean here? What does this word mean? How is it used other ways? And you go and you start searching out that way, and well, that's a great study the way you want to do it. But at the same time, you got to continue and think, do we have any kind of a contradiction with anything else? Can anyone think of a contradiction that this could be angels coming to earth and marrying women? That's right. Angels don't marry. And they don't procreate and offer their little baby angels to marry someone else. That doesn't work. So there we have a contradiction. And we see this. It's in Genesis 6:2 we just read, where it says sons of God saw the daughters of men. But Christ said in Matthew 22:30, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage. That's talking about in heaven. There's no marriage there. But are like angels of God in heaven. So the angels do not marry. They don't do it. All angels are mentioned in male gender in the Scriptures. I don't think there's no female gender angel mentioned. I don't think so. I think it's all male gender. So here Christ says angels neither marry or are given in marriage. And one might say, well, that's when they're in heaven. That's when they're in heaven. When an angel sins and he's cast out, maybe he's free to do anything he wants to do at that time. Maybe then he can marry. But the problem with that thought is, once they're cast out, they're no longer called sons of God. You don't find that. They're just that which the angels have fallen, not sons of God. And what we see here in verse 6 and verse 2, they're called sons of God. So that's just like calling a Christian who has departed from the ways of Christ, calling that person a child of God. They're not. They're not a child of God, not anymore unless something changes. So I don't think this is speaking about angels who fell from heaven and took on wives, and giants began to multiply the face of the earth. I don't think it's going that route. There's some contradictions there. Things don't add up. Now there's some people who think so. That this is it. And there's some writings that go back to around 200 BC by individuals that try and explain it. There's a book called First Enoch. It's one of those apocryphal books that are out there. And it gives an explanation of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 or 5 there. Now, the First Enoch is not an inspired book. Now, you got to understand that. God had nothing to do with it. It's just somebody who wrote. And they probably were writing what the thinking was of the time. But First Enoch says that 200 angels left heaven. They came to earth, and they noticed these beautiful daughters that were on earth. So each of these angels took a wife. 200 angels took 200 wives. These angels, they knew a lot of magic because they came from heaven. They taught their wives a lot of magical medicine. Maybe, magical medicine. Figure out whatever it might be. Incantations. These angels taught their wives incantations. So it sounds a little bit like witchcraft. These angels taught their wives how to garden. I didn't know there was gardening in heaven. They came and taught their wives how to garden. The women, they became pregnant and they gave birth to these babies, and these babies became giants. What do you mean by giants? They grew to be some 30 cubits tall. 30 cubics. That's about 45 foot. 45 foot. This ceiling's probably 45 foot. Here they are walking around, jolly green giant, walking around the face of the earth. Well, giants have to eat a lot. And they're eating everything, what this verse Enoch says. They're eating all the food. The little humans, they were getting hungry. They couldn't keep the food. So the earthlings begin to hate them. Because these giants were eating birds and beasts. And eventually they started eating these other little humans. Catching them, eating them. Because they're running out of food. And God sees this. And God says, this cannot continue. These giants are going to kill everything. So God brings the flood that destroys the giants, along with everybody else that's wicked, except for 8 souls, Noah and his family. And therefore God cleansed the earth of these giants. That's the story that some taught 200 BC, the book of 1 Enoch. It can get pretty wild. When you think of giant, we sort of think of Goliath. You know, he was 9 foot, 9, something like that, what it was. Now, they cook it on up there at around 45 foot tall. Is where it was going. So that's how, when a man's imagination gets started, all of a sudden we begin, okay, the sons of God are these fallen angels, and now we got these giants, and here we go. And man sometimes can just sort of get off there on the limb and do things and say things that totally contradict the Scriptures. So that's a second view, which I don't think that view is correct either. I think the first view is what we looked at is correct. Seth and Cain's lineage getting together. There's a third view. Go back to Genesis 6 and verse 2. The sons of God are a high class of rulers. So we got somewhere between creation and the flood. Populations are growing. Well, somebody's got to be rulers. Somebody's going to be, got to look after things. And they say the sons of God here are your high class individuals, your rulers, your kings, princes, and things like that. Royalty that would take people and begin to rule over them. And the daughters of men are just the common people. Common. So you had these rulers, royalty, who takes on the daughters of men, just average, common, everyday lady, marries, and of course they have children, they say, and the children become giants in their field. Not giants as far as height goes, but men of influence. Great men of influence. And maybe these men of great influence wasn't godly influence, because things began to get very wicked, as we know. So therefore God destroyed the earth here this time with the flood, all because of this. You had your royalty married a common person, children came about, and they brought about wickedness. The problem with that is that if you look at the first 11 chapters in the Bible, you don't find anything like that. You don't find royalty. You don't find kings and queens. You don't find any of that stuff happening. Apparently wasn't in existence at that time yet, until later on after the flood, when it began to populate, the world did. And then you had your pharaohs and Herods and kings and queens and things like that. But up to this point, to the flood, that's not mentioned. And it seemed that maybe if this is speaking of royalty marrying common women, well then somewhere the Bible would have spoke of some royalty being around at that time. But just because you might say royalty marries common folk doesn't mean it's going to fill the world with wickedness. Doesn't mean that will, but some want to go that way and think so. In verse 3, Genesis 6 and verse 3, he mentions something here that's interesting. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." Folks were living a lot longer during this time. What does he mean, 120 years? What's the 120 years about? This is God saying, sometime in the next 120 years, this flood's going to happen. It's going to take place. My spirit's not going to strive with man. 120 years, it's all going to be over. So here we find a timeline that was set by God. Noah started building. He didn't build over 120 years. And the scriptures seem that the day that he drove the last nail, or put the last peg in, that's when God said, load them up, or here they come, load them up. And the frame started. So we see the 120 years there in Genesis 6 and verse 3. That's a time frame of when the flood is going to start. And God has given that. And then he goes out and he picks Noah, and there the ark building begins. In chapter 6 and verse 4, notice it says, "There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them." If one were to say that these are angels, well, the giants were already on the earth at that time. Notice there were giants on the earth in those days, and afterwards, when the sons of God, if that's angels, came and took the daughters of men. The giants are already here. Now that takes away that there was marriage between the angels and the ladies, and they brought about giants. Now it says they were already here when that happened. Those were, there in verse 4, those were the mighty men who were of old. These are the older days prior to this. Men of renown. Men who had maybe a good name, a great name maybe. When you mentioned their name, you recognized them, and maybe they were the ones, the sons of God. Maybe they're the ones that went in Seth's line and married those of Cain. So there's another verse that shows these giants were already present before these sons of God took on these women and married. The only other time in the scriptures we find where the word giant is used is in Numbers 13:33. This is when the spies go out and spy out the promised land. And there we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, so that we were in their sight. And so we were in their sight. That's the only time it's used. Same word, same Hebrew word, giants. So what did they see? What did those spies see? How big were these men? Well, we were like grasshoppers. So we don't know what the height was, anything like that. big and tall, I don't know. But they were scared to go to them and fight. So 2 times the word giant is used there in the Scriptures. We do know of Goliath. He was a big man. Goliath had 4 brothers. You would think that they were big men as well. But there's another man, a king, in the Bible who was big also. Deuteronomy 3:11. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants. So he's a descendant. Indeed, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. It is not in Rabbath of the people of Ammon. 9 cubits is its length, and 4 cubits its width, according to the standard cubic. If a cubit is 18 inches, and there's different measures in the Bible, but generally it's accepted to be 18 inches. That bed's 13 foot long, and that bed is 6 foot wide, just for him. He's a tall man. I don't know if he filled it all up or not. That'd be a tall man to have a bed 13 foot long. It was made of steel to hold him up. Apparently, he weighed a good bit to hold him up, and so there were giants in that day, tall men, but maybe not giants, like 45 foot tall or something like that. Just giants. But I believe Genesis 6 is talking about the marriage of Seth's lineage and Cain's lineage crossed over. And a lot of evil came from those relationships. Anything else tonight? Okay, we'll pick up again next week on a topic. We may, it's been asked about choirs in church. A lot of churches have them. What about that? What about soloists? What about